The United Nations has described an airstrike on a funeral in Yemen which killed or wounded hundreds of people as a horrendous attack which showed no regard for human life. Officials say that more than 140 people died and at least 500 were wounded. A pro-government coalition led by Saudi Arabia says that it will investigate but has denied it was behind the attack. That's even though the funeral was attended by supporters of the Iranian-backed rebels who've been fighting for control of the country. Well, to discuss this story further, Sky's Willem Marks is here. And Willem, have we had any reaction from the UK government to this?
We have. We've had a statement from the Foreign Office Minister Tobias Ellwood, who's responsible for the Middle East. He's deeply concerned. The scenes from the site are shocking. He's raising concerns with the Saudi ambassador to London, and he urges the Saudi-led coalition announced investigation into the incident to take place as a matter of urgency. He says that there can be no military solution to this conflict. A lot of Yemenis say, well, that's interesting because Britain has sold £3.3 billion worth of weapons to the Saudis in the 18 months since this conflict began. British forces have been involved in the targeting of airstrikes historically, though they pulled back from that position. The British government has repeatedly been given reports by UN organisations and Human Rights Watch, other human rights organisations, talking about how poor the targeting has been of airstrikes in the past. And Britain, as many people will point out to you, do have obligation under arms treaties not to supply weapons to governments that then use them against civilians. A lot of Yemenis saying this is clearly another example of that. When will this stop?
So perhaps the Yemenis are victim of some geopolitical forces at play.
To some extent. And, you know, the American government have come out in the wake of this strike and said that they are now going to continue to scale back their involvement in the conflict. They've described this as, you know, their support for Saudi is not a blank check when they see a large number of civilians being killed in this way. The Saudi government initially denied that they were involved in the strike. They're not now completely admitting they were, but they are saying they're going to look into it. Of course, they're part of a broader coalition. And then we also have a statement from the UN Deputy Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs, it's a man called Stephen O'Brien. He said, "This horrendous and heinous act displayed an utter disregard for human life. International humanitarian law is very clear. Warring parties must protect civilians and distinguish between military and civilian targets. I call for a swift, transparent and impartial investigation into this incident. Surely enough is enough." One of the big criticisms of the Saudi Arabian investigations in the past into similar incidents, they've not been independent, they've not been transparent. The real criticism coming from people in Yemen is their targeting is not good enough. If they want to go after targets belonging to the Houthi rebels or other forces, dozens of different groups there operating at the moment, they should go after those military targets, but they are often not managing to do that, according to all the human rights organisations that have been on the ground.
Willem, thanks for unpicking a very complex situation in Yemen. Now, the Saudi-led coalition that's fighting rebel forces in Yemen says it will investigate yesterday's airstrike on a funeral in the capital, Sana'a, which killed more than 140 people and injured more than 500, as we were just discussing. The coalition has denied it was carrying out the attack, even though many rebel supporters were at the event. Well, earlier I spoke to Iona Craig, who is a journalist previously based in the Yemen capital as a correspondent for The Times, and I asked her how likely it was that Saudi planes were actually involved in this attack.
I've investigated numerous strikes on that have caused mass civilian casualties in Yemen from the ground. And on all those occasions, the Saudis have denied involvement in those strikes. Similarly, they've repeatedly hit hospitals in Yemen, up to 58, the data shows that they've hit, repeatedly bombed MSF hospitals as well, and yet on most occasions have denied any involvement in any of those strikes. So, yeah, I think it should be seen with a great deal of scepticism that their denials can be taken as reliable. I think is quite clear at this point that they can't be taken seriously on those kind of statements.
And as a result of this strike, the US have announced that they're going to be reviewing their support for that coalition. How should the international community be reacting to what we're seeing in Yemen?
Well, unfortunately, both the US and the UK have both avoided the suspension of arms sales to Saudi Arabia repeatedly over the last year and a half, despite the mounting evidence from human rights organisations, from journalists of violations of international humanitarian law. And most recently, last month, and even this is a repeat on September last year as well, have managed to shelve a UN Security Council resolution into creating an independent, internationally led inquiry into these violations. So at the moment, these are all being done by Saudi Saudi Arabia and will continue to do so, because both the US and the UK have supported Saudi doing that rather than calling for an internationally led inquiry. The UK specifically has repeatedly refused to acknowledge that there might be cases where British supplied weapons are being used in these kind of airstrikes. Meanwhile, the UK has licensed the sale of £3.3 billion worth of bombs and weapons to Saudi Arabia just since the conflict started. So it is possible that British weapons were involved in this airstrike yesterday.
Well, let's get more now on the news emerging today that Gatwick Airport wants to build a second runway, regardless of whether the government gives it permission to expand. A decision